Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Alright, so now we're going to cover the Southern reaction to Reconstruction. We know what the Northern Union was trying to do. The Military Reconstruction Acts, they were funding Reconstruction. They were the ones who were the driving force of Reconstruction. Now we're going to go into the Southern reaction of Reconstruction. So now that the slaves were freed, they faced many challenges when it came to blending into society. So prior to Reconstruction, remember, the slaves could not get married. But now this unofficial married slave couple, now that they're free, they could actually legalize their marriages in court. Families who were torn apart at the slave auctions were now putting ads out in the local newspapers trying to reunite with lost family members. Many of these freed African Americans moved from predominantly white counties where they were living to places with more African Americans, people who shared the same culture. So this is just an ad that you could see that somebody put out in the newspaper. Samuel Dove wishes to know the whereabouts of his mother. Looks like it says Arnino, his sisters Maria, Naziah, and Peggy, and his brother Edmund, who were owned by George Dove of Rockingham County, Shenandoah Valley, sold to Richmond, after which Samuel and Edmund were taken to Nashville, Tennessee by Joe Mick. Arnio was left at the Eagle Tavern, Richmond. So that's a newspaper article that somebody put out in the newspaper to try to find their family. Now that the enslaved have been emancipated, some started to demand that they had the same economic and political rights and opportunities for land ownership just like their white counterparts. And since many of the new freed slaves or newly freed African Americans excelled at farming, many of them wanted to own their own land. Many of the white planters refused to give up any of their land, of course, any of their plantations, even when General William T. Sherman of the Union Army issued Special Field Orders Number 15, which was a wartime order that gave these newly emancipated black men no more than 40 acres of land and a mule. And after the Civil War, the government gave that land back to the planters, which was taken away by the Special Field Order Number 15. You've heard me say black codes before. So you have to remember that prior to the Civil War, there were slave codes, and these slave codes were put in place that limited the movement and success of any slave in the South. So after the Civil War and the passing of the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, slavery was abolished, right? So southern states couldn't have slave codes anymore, so they decided to create a new set of laws. Remember, these were laws. They were not just something that was put on paper, that limited the freed slaves in the South, or the freed men, the newly emancipated in the South, and they were called black codes. Remember, after Lincoln was assassinated and President Johnson took office, Johnson put his own Reconstruction plan into effect. And Johnson had approved many of the new state legislatures in the South who began to pass these black codes that denied civil rights to freed African Americans in the South. So every state in the South had passed these laws that greatly limited the freedom of these freed slaves. Remember, these black codes were another thing that led to that strong opposition between President Johnson's plan to Reconstruction, the freed African Americans everywhere in the South, and the radical Republicans. And African Americans in the South organized to oppose these black codes. So I have a couple of black codes here that I want to read you. Just a quick edited example of it. So it says, now that the slaves have become emancipated, it is necessary to pass regulations that preserve public order. These regulations must also preserve the comfort and correct behavior of the former slaves. Therefore, the following rules have been adopted with the approval of the United States military authorities who have commanded this area. Number 1, every Negro is required to be in regular service of some white person or former owner who shall held responsible for the conduct of that Negro. No public meetings or congregations of Negroes should be allowed after sunset. No Negro shall be permitted to preach or otherwise speak out to congregations of colored people without special permission in writing from the government. It says that Negroes may legally marry, own property, and sue and be sued in court. They may not serve in juries. They may not testify against a white person in the court of law. It shall be illegal for a Negro or person of Negro descent to marry a white person. Negroes should not be permitted outside in public after sundown without permission in writing from the government. They should not sell, trade, exchange merchandise within the area without the special permission of his employer. No Negroes allowed in the military service or should be allowed to carry firearms or any kind of weapons. So these are the type of codes, these laws, these black codes that were put into place to try to control the newly emancipated. Who else was trying to control the newly emancipated in the South? Well, we have the introduction to the KKK. So after slavery ended and the military Reconstruction Acts were implemented, remember, African Americans became, active in politics. They started to gain political power in southern states. Harlem Rebels in 1870 became, the first African American man. He was actually born in North Carolina and became a Republican senator-elect from Mississippi, the same state that elected Jefferson Davis to the Confederacy. So Southern white Democrats were mad. By the end of Reconstruction, there were nearly 100 African Americans elected to state legislatures in the South. So Reconstruction was succeeding. The Southern white Democrats believed that African Americans shouldn't hold any power in the United States. And in 1866, 6 veterans of the Confederate Army of Tennessee created a hate group, which we know today as the Ku Klux Klan, shortened to the KKK. The KKK was organized primarily as a reaction to these African Americans who were voted into these positions of power, into Congress. One of the most well-known and original members of the KKK was the, prominent Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest from Tennessee. It was a secret society of members who wore their masks, those hoods. I'm sure you could picture it, and there's some pictures on the screen there. That they wanted to hide their identity. They opposed civil rights, particularly suffrage or the right to vote for African Americans. They used violence and intimidation that included massacres, lynching, rape, pillaging, and terror to attempt to control these African Americans in the South. White supremacy ran rampant throughout the South, and local governments didn't do anything to stop the violence. If they did anything, it was very little. It's because probably members of society, like law enforcement, ministers, merchants, military officers, police officers, anything like that, they were the ones who were donning the hoods and burning the crosses and murdering those who crossed their path. So it was people who you're supposed to look up to and respect, the people of power. Congress had the right to pass these laws that made it a federal crime to interfere with elections or to deny citizens this equal protection under the law under the 14th Amendment. So for many of the free African Americans, this new world after the Civil War and after slavery during Reconstruction looked a lot like the old world before Reconstruction. Many of the whites tried to force these free blacks back onto plantations through tenant farming and through sharecropping. And in order to sidestep this 15th Amendment allowing black males to vote, Democrats, Southern white Democrats, instituted these roadblocks against African American suffrage, or the right to vote. Suffrage means the right to vote. New laws like these poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were put in place to suppress African American votes in the South. And when it came to a segregated society, even though it was not law, it turned to a de facto segregation, or basically meaning the segregation by just the fact that it exists. And that is what brings us to Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation in the United States that primarily affected Southern African Americans. The purpose of these Jim Crow laws was to return the Southern states to an antebellum or pre-war class structure by marginalizing black Americans and black communities and individuals that attempted to defy these Jim Crow laws. They were often met with violence and death. The name Jim Crow comes from an insulting song lyric regarding black people, and these Jim Crow laws were put in place after Reconstruction fell in 1877 and lasted all the way until the mid-1960s, when the modern-day civil rights movement produced the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and some argue that they were not extinguished until 1968, or even not extinguished until today. So let's cover these quick voting issues that we discussed 2 minutes ago. Many of these Southern Democrats tried to get the president to veto the 15th Amendment, and when that was not an option, they did these three things to try to stop Southern free black men from practicing suffrage or practicing voting, and they were literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause. A literacy test was when the Democrats passed these laws that mandated that a person had to read in order to vote. Now remember, most blacks were not educated because as slaves they were not allowed to have an education. So when they were asked to read the Constitution, they couldn't pass the tests. So this gave them, or this took away, the right for freed blacks to vote. Another thing is a poll tax. The Democrats passed this voter qualification law that mandated that a person had to pay a $2 tax in order to vote. And this was a lot of money for a newly freed slave who couldn't afford it. The next one we're going to cover, and the last one we're going to cover here, is the grandfather clause. Democrats passed a voter qualification law that mandated that a person could only vote if their grandfather had been eligible to vote and had been a citizen. Since most of the African Americans in the South, since most of their grandfathers had also been slaves, they did not qualify to vote under this law either. So these laws were specifically designed to take away the political power of free blacks in the South by taking away their right to vote in the 15th Amendment. This is known as attempting to disenfranchise black voters in the South. Now, I don't know if you've heard that when this video is made, it's 2020, and I don't know if you've heard that term, disenfranchising voters. The word franchise means the right to vote, just like suffrage, and to disenfranchise it, it means to take it away. And that's what a lot of people were complaining about in the election of 2020, that there was a lot of black people's votes were getting disfranchised in the South. Next, we're going to cover the greatest of betrayals.